Deputy Speaker, it is our collective responsibility to leave the next generation with better opportunities than we've had, to be good ancestors. But in failing to address housing affordability, we are not living up to this responsibility. House prices relative to incomes across Australian capital cities have become some of the highest in the world, with Sydney having the second most unaffordable housing in the world after Hong Kong. I acknowledge that the government has made some positive steps in this place, and I acknowledge that the government has actually put housing on the agenda in this parliament, and I think that's absolutely critical. And I know the government has committed significant resources into this area. But I believe that after 2 decades of frankly, buck passing between federal, state and local governments and the major parties, we have to do more. And we have to do more here, but we have to do more at each level of government. And I think there are 4 key areas that the federal government can have a significant impact even further than where it is now. Firstly, we need to strengthen the incentives for state and local governments to unlock housing approvals in Australian urban areas. Secondly, we need to support the availability of skills and materials to bring down costs and increase the viability of development. Thirdly, we need to push the states to improve renters' rights, particularly in New South Wales, where I'm from, where we still have no grounds evictions, which are for undermining renters' rights across my state. And finally, we need to reform the tax system to provide greater and more equal opportunities for housing in Australia. Housing represents a fundamental source of security that enables family planning as well as a comfortable retirement. But housing is increasingly out of reach for younger generations. Since 1981, the rate of home ownership for those aged between 30 and 34 has declined 20% to fewer than half. Over the same period, the share of people relying on the bank of mum and dad to buy their first home has increased from 19% to 40%. That is not the Australian dream. We are a country where it doesn't matter what your parents earn. It shouldn't matter what they have. You should have access to those opportunities and the ability, where if you're a nurse and a teacher coming together to be able to build a home, buy a home and set up your family. Unaffordable housing increases inequality and division in our society, but it robs our cities of essential workers, worsens the brain drains of our best and brightest, and discourages migrants who we need as our population naturally ages. I'd like to start firstly on the area of the housing accord and how to build these homes. This 1.2 million homes that the government has committed to focusing on is absolutely critical. But I'm concerned that the target is seen as out of reach and that we don't have interim incentives for the states and local governments to take action now to help them through the difficult planning and reforms that they need to take on and to sell to the electorate over the next period of 5 years. I think they need some interim support to deliver this. And then secondly, my second significant concern is about the skills and the materials. And I agree with the RBA that, frankly, our infrastructure pipeline, both at the federal level and at all the state levels, is so significant that is actually increasing construction costs, both at in both labour and in materials, at a time when our focus must be on housing. So I call on the government to delay infrastructure spending that it can, particularly those large projects that are competing with those costs. At the same time, reform the migration, the new fast-track migrant visa to ensure that construction workers are not kept out of that visa group, because those group of construction workers should be, if we need them, we should be bringing them in and bringing them in as fast as we possibly can. Thirdly, would like to say that I would like to see the government continue to put pressure on the states and possibly through incentives to make the reforms to rental rights that is absolutely required, both in terms of no grounds evictions, but also increasing the incentives for longer-term leases. And I recognise what is actually before the Senate at the moment, and it's something I spoke on this morning, the opportunity to increase the housing, some social and affordable housing, by improving those incentives, the tax incentives, but actually at the same time increasing affordable housing and also increasing long-term leases for those people in those build-to-rent environments. I think that's absolutely critical. I urge the Senate to to adopt those bills. And finally, I'm going to talk about the tax system, because there are a number of taxes that affect the housing system. It's not the main driver, but they are key. Stamp duty is a tax on people who move. It is inequitable. It is a state tax, but the federal government can be part of the solution in terms of driving that. Secondly, your negative gearing and capital gains tax, they are not the main drivers of costs of housing, but they do play into the difficulties for people to own their own homes. And I think that it is a reasonable thing for the government to be looking at that. There are a few areas that are going to define opportunities of a generation. Housing is one, and this is one that we must act in this parliament and everyone in the future.